Welcome to the first episode of the Kinvestor Report in 2026. I'm your host, Arlen Hansen, and on the Kinvestor Report, I get to chat with industry experts to discuss the market, commodities, stocks, the economy, and today, even Bitcoin, and so much more. As always, this interview is not investment advice. I'm not a professional advisor or geologist. However, I have been investing and kicking rocks for over 24 years, visited mine sites around the world, and have certainly taken a bath or two in the markets. Do not follow my lead. Any financial interest Kin or myself has in the companies mentioned today interview will be disclosed, and be sure to do your own due diligence, of course. Today, I'm super honored to have this guy named Seb Bunney join me. I met him about a month ago in my local town, Squamish, British Columbia. And it was probably one of the most fascinating conversations I've had about money, gold, and Bitcoin in many, many years. He's a best-selling author of two books on Amazon, one called B is for Bitcoin, and the other one, number one best-selling book, is The Hidden Cost of Money. And he explores how money shapes human behavior and society. I guarantee you are going to get something out of this interview listening to Seb. This guy is a wealth of knowledge. I'm certainly not the one who's interested in this conversation today. Seb,
For
thank you
sure.
so much for joining the show. How you doing? I can see that you're enjoying the same weather as I am, that now that you live a block away from me.
No, man, it's the high pressure blue sky system. It's
Oh,
phenomenal.
finally, finally. So to my audience, Seb, I haven't told you this before, but we met about a month ago at a friend's lunch, and you said that you wrote a book called B is for Bitcoin. And what you don't know is that I literally rolled my eyes and gagged at that time. I was like, oh my God, I got to sit with this guy and talk about Bitcoin for the next 2 hours. But I have to say, it was probably one of the most fascinating conversations I've had in years about money and finances and society, and people and our nervous systems. And I just felt like it's really about time for me to take off my ignorance cap and to learn more about the history of this and how Bitcoin came to be and what the role of Bitcoin in the future is going to be, right? So I'm going to come out with the questions that I don't really know much about, because this Bitcoin's new to me, right? It shouldn't be, but it is. But I kind of want to start the conversation. It's just like, why money and what's the history of money? Like how
For
does it
sure.
like let's start there because I think there's a lot of sections to talk about how we got to Bitcoin, but it starts with history. So let's start there.
One, like first I just want to say, like, I hugely appreciated our lunch. I've really enjoyed our conversations. And I came from gold. I absolutely loved gold. I'm a very like pro sound money advocate. How do we have money that works for the people? And one thing that I've found is even now, I've been in Bitcoin speaking publicly on the world stage podcasts for 6 years. And even now, when I go to like lunches like we had, I feel uncomfortable saying I work in Bitcoin because ultimately I know that there's this huge societal aversion to Bitcoin, and everyone just think it's the number go up, the next lottery ticket, it's speculative, all of these things. There's so many narratives around Bitcoin, and so I just really admire people that are curious. They want to have that intellectual openness to actually look at something and peel back the layers. Because I think that we live in a society where life is hard, the cost of living is rising, and so it takes energy to actually be curious about something as opposed to just listen to what everyone else is saying. And the final thing I'll just quickly say is that I think when it comes to gold and Bitcoin, I very much believe we're all on the same side. Ultimately, it's not about gold, it's not about Bitcoin, it's about how do we just have a monetary system that supports society, where it allows capital to flow to where value is being created, where people are able to thrive, where people are able to preserve purchasing power and show up more authentically. And I think that's ultimately what gold bugs want. It's ultimately what Bitcoiners want. And so I think now it's just about having a discussion about what asset or what potential monetary solution offers the best probability or chances of us achieving that. And it can be a balance of these things. So I think kind of like framing the conversation from there. But going back to kind of the question, why money? Or like, what is money? I think it's really important to start with this question because I think a lot of people, Bitcoiners, gold bugs, average Joes, we never actually stop just to ask the question of like, what is this thing that we use every single day to go and purchase groceries, to go buy houses, we swap our time and energy for money. And so at its root, I tend to look at money as simply a battery. It stores human effort, our time and our energy. When we go to work, we expend time and energy, and we're remunerated with money. and then we can go and use that money at a future date in time to go and purchase the things that we need. And why money? Because ultimately, prior to money, we were living in barter economies. And the challenge with a barter economy is that you need what's called the coincidence of wants. And the coincidence of wants is if you produce a good or a service, let's say, I don't know, you have sheep and I am a baker. Well, you and I, we naturally need to be able to find this coincidence of wants. You want bread, I want lamb, or I want something to sheep, wool, and we have to find a trade that works. The problem with society on waiting or hoping that you can find someone that needs what you want while you have what they need is there's a lot of coincidence in there, and I think the probability is very slim. So it's hard for society to thrive. So what money ultimately enabled was delayed exchange, where someone could swap their good or service for this intermediary holding tool, which they could then use that tool down the line to go and purchase what it is that they need. And so money allowed civilization to thrive. Communities, societies were able to transact value between one another. Otherwise, it's kind of like a fend for oneself kind of environment. So ultimately, I think money really enabled humans to thrive. Money enabled us to become what we are today and where we are today. And yeah, I think money is so important just to discuss this idea of what is money. And one quick little side tangent, sometimes people refer to money as like, man, how do we have sound money? And many gold bugs may know this term, sound money, but where does it come from? It comes from this idea that like when you had a gold coin or a silver coin, if you flick it, you can hear it's got that like whoa, whoa, whoa.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah, yeah, yeah. The
really
the
deep.
helicopter sound.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
sound money, if you flick a copper coin, you don't get that sound. And so you're able to determine what is good money, what is sound money by its sound. And you can also just feel it when you tap it against your teeth. There's a density to gold and silver. Anyway, slight tangent.
It's not a tangent at all. Those are the interesting nuances that you bring into conversations that I love learning about, to be quite honest. Okay, so how, when did like so we were bartering all these years of our lives, and then at what point did it have to start changing and turning into an actual currency that was being exchanged rather than a goods or service?
For sure. That's a really good question. And so I should say that when we actually look back throughout history, we don't have a definitive account of what happened. So there's only really theories about what happened. You can look at, there's Adam Smith, there's David Graeber, there's all of these various individuals that have theories about how money evolved over time. But I think that one that a lot of people kind of tend to somewhat align on, Adam Smith talks about how we moved from a barter society, so this coincidence of wants that we've been discussing, and then we recognized, okay, our societies, once we get to a certain amount of humans, we're really struggling to transact with one another because not everyone has what I need, and not everyone needs what I have. And so we started to find and start to converge on various commodities as this form of money. And so we've seen throughout history, we've seen things like salt, we've seen things like shells, glass beads, stones. All of these things had some form of local scarcity in their area. And because of this local scarcity and the fact that it couldn't be diluted easily, people started to converge in the local community and use these as intermediaries for trade. What is really fascinating, there's an amazing article, and I really recommend anyone going and reading it. There's an article called Masters and Slaves of Money by a guy called Robert Breedlove. And what he talks about is he talks about how the African American population in many parts used glass beads as money. Now, the problem with glass beads is African society at its time, because it was relatively primitive, it was incredibly hard for them to create glass beads, to blow glass. Whereas Europeans, they had glass blowing down. And so when the Europeans came to Africa, they were just like, you guys are using glass beads as money? Like, we can produce these en masse. So what did they do? They went and blew all of these glass beads and then by the boatload bought these glass beads to Africa. And that was part of the like impetus for the African slave trade, because they were able to essentially buy up all of the African resources, buy slaves, and it devalued their currency. And so ultimately, what you start to recognize is that these commodities that were being used as money, they may be scarce in one locale, but that doesn't mean they were globally scarce. And so this is where gold comes in. Ultimately, these areas were trending on the money that was most scarce, and a bunch of communities started to recognize that gold was this like globally recognized medium of exchange, store of value that was globally scarce. And so when you look throughout history, it's no coincidence that gold kind of was this emergent consensus that many different communities were relying on gold. Because ultimately, it didn't matter where you go, whether you went to America, whether you went to the African nations, whether you went to Asia, gold was scarce in every one of these
It was
locations.
a global scarcity rather than like a centralized scarcity.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this just sounds like evolution to me, right? Like a bartering society cannot work in global trade.
Mhm.
When you talk about
Absolutely.
like so this is just evolution, right? So we were bartering because we lived in these smaller communities, but then as we started reaching out around the world, that just no longer worked anymore. So we naturally had to evolve to a different system, and then that sounded like this is where gold kind of came into play as a
Totally.
currency. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is that gold ultimately enabled nations that didn't trust one another to still trade with one another. With a barter system, there's a lot of trust involved. On top of that, you have to know people, you have to know who offers what. It becomes very convoluted. And again, we're talking about that coincidence of once. There's a lot of probability that, man, I hope that I can meet someone who has what I need and I can offer what they want. Whereas with gold, you could have nations that are enemies, but they recognize that, hey, this person has value in this aspect, this service, or this good. And they're like, you know what? We want gold. Gold enables our community to thrive. So we're willing to transact in gold. And so it enabled global trade. And the other thing that's really interesting is when we actually look back from more of a scientific lens, you start to recognize that gold is arguably the only thing that could have been used as kind of a globally scarce form of money, because you can look at this evolution of money through the lens of the periodic table. And what you recognize is, okay, everyone in their mind visualize that periodic table. If we go start removing first the gases and liquids, because naturally argon, helium, hydrogen, you can't use those as money. It's not going to work.
Can't
So
trade. Yeah.
can't trade with gases and liquids. Next, there are the things called the lanthanides or the actinides. And ignore me if I'm butchering this. I don't really talk about these subjects very often, so I may not have pronounced that properly. But these are elements that basically decay and become radioactive. So
Radioactive.
you've got
Yep.
to remove all of those. Now, the alkaline metals, these are highly reactive at regular pressure and room temperature. So got to remove all of those. And then you get all of what are called the transition, post-transition metals and metalloids. And there's about 30 of these. And these are awesome. They're solid, they're non-flammable, they're non-toxic. So things like nickel and copper, but they're abundant. And so nickel and copper, when you start making money out of them, where you can find such an abundance of them that you can dilute them so it doesn't store value. And then finally, we end up with the super rare and synthetic elements. So that's osmium. Well, it only exists from meteorites in the Earth's crust. And there's all these synthetic elements that can only be created in labs. So when you work through all of this, you're left with five things, which is platinum, palladium, rhodium, silver, and gold. Now, people have used silver as money, but again, it tarnishes over time and it isn't as scarce as gold. So people kind of tend to prefer gold. And then you've got rhodium and palladium, and those are more recent discoveries. And we don't really have any reference to historical uses of these. So we're left with platinum and gold. And the interesting thing about platinum is its melt point is so much higher than gold that the more traditional ancestral furnaces, they weren't able to get up to heat, so they wouldn't have been able to use platinum. So we're essentially, when you have the periodic table and you whittle it down, what is the natural emergent metal or the natural emergent commodity? It's gold. So it's no wonder that over thousands of years, these communities have all stumbled upon the same thing. It wasn't through conversation. It was because there really only was one thing that stood the test of time. It didn't tarnish and it was scarce.
It was almost like community consensus.
Yeah.
And you know why I said that. We'll talk about more of that
We'll get into that.
later.
Totally.
Well, that's super. So that I actually find that extremely interesting about the periodic table thing. That's quite fascinating.
It's really cool. And there is, if people are interested, there's a few little visualizations online. You can type it in like why gold in the form of money. And you see this periodic table. And what it does is at the moment, I just described to you which elements in which section don't necessarily work as money. But you see it blacking each element out and you see it slowly whittling down until eventually you're left with gold. And so I find it really fascinating. There's
Oh,
a
it's
logical reason why we ended up as gold. But I think that brings us, and I'm curious where you want to go next, but it kind of brings us to the next question, which is like, why did we move away from gold? Why did we move towards fiat currency.
You're a better interviewer than I am, Seb. So yeah, that is my next question. Why did we move away from like a gold-backed currency? From like, let's talk about this evolution.
Totally. So, and again, like I recognize that a lot of your listeners are probably familiar with this. They're deep down the rabbit hole of gold. They understand gold. The reason why I'm laying this out is because I think that it's really important to understand like why did we converge on gold and why did gold kind of like fall out of favor? Why did we move towards fiat currencies? And this will lead us to this question of why Bitcoin, because I think it's really important just to kind of set the foundation. So ultimately, as global trade expanded, we started to see cracks appear. Like gold was obviously given its tangible nature and its weight, it was heavy and it was slow to transact with. So we started to see a lot of these exchanges, these warehouses, they started to create paper claims, or sorry, taking a step back, people weren't necessarily taking custody of their gold and holding it in their own kind of their house in a safe. They were kind of like, I don't necessarily want to deal with the physical, tangible nature of gold. So what would they go and do? They would go and deposit it at the bank. They would go and deposit it at a various warehouse. And these warehouses would issue paper receipts. So you had a claim to that gold that was held in reserve. And these paper claims emerged out of convenience. Rather than having to go and trade the physical, tangible gold, you were able to simply trade the paper claim. So if you and we wanted to transact with one another, I could just hand over the paper claim. We never have to go and move the gold. The gold stays in the warehouse. So what we started to see is custody centralizing. So there were a handful of warehouses, handful of banks that really held the majority of the gold. We saw this custody, all of this gold centralizing in a few locations, and trust started to replace possession. Gold came into being because of its scarcity, because it was a bearer instrument. You could hold it, you could transact with it, but we started to replace that bearer instrument with trust. We started using IOUs, these paper receipts. And the unintended consequence of that over time was that people stopped redeeming their gold because it was easier just to hold the paper receipts. Warehouses recognized this. They recognized, we could make a little bit of extra money here if I started issuing more receipts than there was gold in reserves. So there ended up being more claims than the metal in reserves. So we unintentionally created the first fractional reserve banking system where the warehouse only held a fraction of its reserves on hand. And so,
This
yeah.
this quick question. So if I took if I took assets that weren't mine, like legally mine, and lent them out to other people to make money, is that fraud?
Well, underneath the banking system and banking regulation, it's not fraud. But if anyone went and did this, it 100% is fraud. And so this is
Right.
where
Yeah, that's why I'm just a little scratching my head here. Like, how do they get away with this?
totally, when this is where the banking system basically has a monopoly on money. And if you actually think about the banking system in general and what it does, it has an advantage over everyone else because it can essentially go and print money out of thin air, lend that money out, and charge interest on that money. So they're able to generate revenue without necessarily having a tangible product or a service that, or sorry, without necessarily having the reserves on file. And I should, taking a step back, I think it's a really important question you asked because the question is more around like, are we using a fractional reserve system today? And we've been using the modern fiat banking system has been using a fractional reserve system for the last 50, 100 plus years. And up until 2020 and the pandemic, the US had a 10% fractional reserve rate. And so if you go and deposit $100 into the bank, they can go and lend out 90 of those dollars, maintain $10, 10% as a reserve. And what is fascinating about that is that doesn't mean that they've just gone and effectively gone and lent out those $90, but those $90, whoever receives those $90 could then go and deposit those $90. They'll go lend out another $81, so another 90%. The next person who receives the $81 deposits the $81. And so from a simple deposit of $100, you can expand the monetary supply by over $1,000, which is profound. When you've got a fractional reserve system, it's all basically a house of cards ready to collapse. Because,
Just creating paper for themselves, really, right?
totally.
Yeah. Wow, that's crazy.
But when COVID happened, a lot of the banking system, they were scared of this kind of liquidity crunch. So what do? They remove the reserve requirement. And so the US, since 2020, has got a 0% fractional reserve requirement. So the banks don't have to hold any money on reserve. And Canada, don't quote me on this, I think we've been on this for maybe like 20 or 30 years now. We have had a 0% reserve requirement. So the banks don't have to hold any of your money in reserve. That's just insane.
I think the frustrating thing, like I actually feel myself getting angry right now about this. It's just because of like how we're taught since children to put our money in the banks because they're
Totally.
safe. It's like what we were taught to trust growing up, the banks, the government, like all these things. And when you're saying it's just like none of it's true.
Totally.
It's just blows my mind. Like it's just
Well,
when
and
you
the
hear these
crazy thing,
things,
and
right? Like
this is a slight tangent, but people may be familiar in what was it, 2014 when Greece went under. When Greece went under, what people don't necessarily know are there's these things called bank bail-in laws. And we have these laws in Canada, we have them in the US. And when Greece went under, in many areas, they froze the assets of the Greek citizens and they kept 50% to go and bail out all of the banks. And this is bank bail-in laws. And we can do the same thing here in Canada. Banks, if the bank goes under, it can freeze all its customers' assets. And in many cases, it can actually just issue basically insolvent shares of the bank as a claim, basically in replacement of the money that you held in your bank account. And so you look at this and you're just like, this is insane. The system is so corrupt.
yeah, I think the safety deposit boxes are a joke too. Like, oh my
Mhm.
God, like if your bank, if you're ever in a situation where like the country goes under and the bank has to go bankrupt or whatever, you're not getting what's in your safety deposit box.
100%.
Like, not a chance. Like, you will be
Yeah,
locked out. Those doors are locked. You are not getting what's in your safety deposit box. Period.
totally. Yeah. And so ultimately, what we started to recognize is that people stopped redeeming gold. The warehouses overissued receipts, more claims than metal. And then ultimately, that led to the first kind of fractional reserve banking system, unintentional fractional reserve banking system. There was far more claims on the gold than there was gold in existence. And there, at the same time that this kind of fractional reserve system was evolving, the government also recognized something. The government started to recognize just how potent and how powerful money was as a stimulator for society. And so, if you ever go and study economics, what they teach you in economics is what is called the four factors of production. So, the four factors of production are basically these four levers that make up our economy. So, we have land, labor, capital, and enterprise. Now, what is interesting about these four levers is if you want to stimulate the economy, one of them can do it directly, the other three are indirect. Now, what do I mean by that? First, you've got like the land lever. Now, if we want to stimulate the economy through the land lever, land is all of our natural resources in the ground, it is the forests, it is the waterways, it's all of the food in the oceans. Well, if you want to stimulate the economy through the land lever, what do we have to do? We have to go and find more resources. Now, when we go back throughout history, you look at like the Californian gold rush in the 1800s, that was finding an abundance of gold that they didn't know existed, and all of a sudden it could stimulate the economy. But because of where we are in history right now, with all of the red tape around natural resources, we can't even access our natural resources. On top of that, we've scoured the earth for natural resources. It's going to be very hard for us to stimulate the economy through finding new reserves that we're able to tap into effortlessly. So, yeah, go.
And our Canadian government certainly does not want us to tap into our resources. Like,
No,
I think the red tape on this is disgusting,
totally.
considering the resources that we have, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, we could go on and on. Okay, keep going.
No, and so we naturally, when you're looking at the land lever, that's not really an effective lever to go and stimulate the economy effortlessly. So next up, we have the labor lever. So labor is us as individuals. It's us using our brain power. It's us using our muscles to be able to work machinery, to be able to work in the offices, to be able to create value, to be able to offer services. And again, if we want to stimulate the economy through the labor lever, what do we have to do? Well, we either have to have more people, we have to increase the population size, and it's only really effective if we increase the population size while lowering the average age of the population. With a younger population, you have a more productive population. If you have an aging population, like in Japan or in China, you have the opposite issue, where you
Mhm.
have more people, but the bottom half of the population, in terms of age-wise, are having to support the elderly population, and that creates a massive burden. And so, in order to be able to create change through that lever, what do we have to do? We have to have more kids. People, because of the pressures of the financial pressures of society today, the cost of living, rising food prices, people can't afford to have kids. Not only that, but people have been told for so long, for decades, the world is overpopulated. So a lot of society is petrified about having kids And so they're not having kids. So we've got this issue where actually most Western nations are actually seeing their population start to decline. We're seeing that in countless populations. China, the People's Bank of China released a report, this is maybe a few years back, and they, because of their one child policy, they expect China's population up until 2050 to halve, which is
What?
mind blowing. Yeah, their one child policy
Really?
screwed them. And so this has the opposite issue where we're getting this aging population in Canada, in the UK, in the States, in China. Aging populations are hugely burdensome to economies because naturally the productive class have to subsidize and work to support the aging class. So land lever doesn't necessarily work. Labor lever, not necessarily working. Well, we've got the enterprise lever. Enterprise is our ability to put money, capital, labor, and land together to create technology, to create companies, to create value in society. Now, again, technology can make a huge difference in society. We've seen the increase in productivity in many aspects of society from things like AI. But the problem with technology is it takes so long for technology to kind of percolate up through society and actually create change. AI has been around since the 60s and 70s, yet we're only just in the last 5, 6 years starting to see immense change in society from it. And so if we want to stimulate the economy through the enterprise lever, again, it's not something that you just say, hey, we're going to increase technology, we're going to increase the amount of corporations and the value being created, and next year everything's going to be hunky dory. So it's a delayed change. So that leaves us with one lever left. That lever is the monetary lever, the capital lever. And so you can stimulate the economy very easily with money. You print money, you inject it into the economy, people start spending, we start to see change in the economy. But governments recognize this. They recognize that out of these four levers, if they want to stimulate the economy, what's the easiest one to change? Oh man, we can just print money. And so this is where gold started to be a hindrance. These governments, they've realized that gold basically fails power when they want flexibility. If they want to be able to stimulate the economy, they want to create change, there's a depression, there's a recession, and they want to be able to inject capital, gold prevents them from doing so. Its scarcity effectively constrains governments, and we just need to look throughout history to realize that these crises that we've had throughout history expose that constraint. Whether it has been the 1860s Civil War, where war is expensive, the taxation was insufficient, and the gold reserves were limited, so they issued these things called demand notes. They realized they didn't have enough gold to be able to support the demand notes, so they issued the first greenbacks. This was arguably the first fiat currency in the US. We saw it during World War I again, in the Roaring '20s. World War I, US temporarily abandons the gold peg, money supply expands, inflation rockets. Although the gold peg was later restored, there was too much debt at that point, and so inflation leading up to the 1920s hit over 20% a year. And we saw it again during the Great Depression. And during the Great Depression, we saw Executive Order 6102, where the government effectively banned private ownership of gold, which is mind-blowing. They basically just said, you're forced to sell all your gold to the state for $20.67 an ounce. And then immediately, once everyone has sold all their gold to the state, what do? They reprice gold to $35 an ounce, devaluing the currency by 40% essentially overnight. And so this centralized all this gold, dollar strengthened artificially, monetary lever reclaimed by the government. And so ultimately, when you just look throughout history, you've seen it time and time and time again where gold has been a hindrance to the government stepping in and stimulating or changing the economy to their benefit. And that left us with kind of the final big change, which was in 1971. Lead up to 1971, we had the Vietnam War. Again, war is costly. The expanding welfare state from the 60s, the government was spending beyond the gold peg. And so a lot of foreign nations recognized, look, you're holding our gold. This is from, for people that aren't necessarily familiar, there was something called Bretton Woods, where basically a lot of the world reserve currencies held all of their gold in the US. And so the gold was spending beyond its means. A lot of these foreign countries were like, man, I don't think you have the gold to be able to support that spending. So France ended up sending a giant warship to the US and said, give us back our gold. And immediately after they gave back France the gold and they realized they weren't able to do that for every country, Nixon ended gold convertibility and the US became fiat currency. It's backed by nothing but our trust and faith in gold.
That's what you get. That's what you say. The saying is like you get caught with your pants down.
100%.
France shows up with a warship. Oh, I love that. Okay, so we've got a huge problem. right? We've issued all these promissory notes backed by gold, but it's not really matching anymore.
Gold can be taken advantage of. So what we've seen is that gold works in calm periods. It fails politically in crises because a lot of these nations that have pegged their currency to gold, well, they're just like, man, I can't expand the money supply. So what do we have to do? Well, we have to kind of depeg, expand the money supply. What that leads to is inflation, devaluation of currency, loss of purchasing power, and who feels the effects? It's us as individuals. It's society. It's the individual that is trying to put food on the table for its kids, for its family, put a roof over its head. All of a sudden, life becomes unbelievably hard. And so we've experienced these kind of boom bust periods of inflation throughout history, and they tend to be after crises. And so, with all of this in mind, it kind of leads us to this idea of just like, why Bitcoin? And I would say that like the reason why we've kind of moved away from gold is that gold absolutely has value, but it's gold solved the money problem for its time, and the world has changed. We have seen increased trade, we have seen increased travel, we have seen the digitization of the world of knowledge, the majority of trade transactions, the online economy. Most trade is done digitally. And because of obviously gold's tangible nature, it has struggled to adapt. And so we store the abstraction, gold receipts, but that reintroduced trust, and trust reintroduced manipulation. And so I think it begs this question of like, what would money look like if we were to go back to scratch and design something off this idea of gold and scarcity? And I truly believe that what that money would look like is Bitcoin. And it's no wonder that people refer to Bitcoin as digital gold, because the reason why we lean into gold is because of gold scarcity. Gold is scarce, which allowed it to preserve purchasing power. The lack of dilution meant that if you own 1% of the gold supply, you know that in the future you're going to own close to 1% of the gold supply still. You're going to have a little bit of dilution from new supply entering the market. But outside of that, you can be confident that you're not going to get this outsized dilution that we've seen with fiat currencies. And so, yeah,
That begs the question of like, do we really know how much gold is in circulation? So if you own 1 ounce of gold, do you even know how much percentage of what's out in circulation? No, you can't.
you can't. And you know what? That's a really interesting point, because I think that a lot of Bitcoiners would argue that one of the flaws with gold is that there's a lot of manipulation around how much gold is actually in circulation, how much is entering supply. And one perfect example of this is if you ever go and listen to, I think it's Jeff Snyder, who works for Alhambra Investments. He's a big gold bug. He has a series called the Eurodollar University, and he kind of breaks down a lot of the history of kind of gold, money, US dollars, the Eurodollar system, and such. And one of the things he talks about is how the central banks, which do hold, if I remember correctly, around 20% of all gold in supply, the central banks globally have never been audited. We have no idea how much gold is actually sitting in these vaults that these central banks claim to hold. Not only that, we do know that these central banks can claim IOUs, gold leases, gold swaps as physical gold. And so what we've seen throughout history is, let's say you're a gold miner and you have tenure to operate in an area in northern BC, and you think, wow, I think there's 1 ton, from my assessments, there's 1 ton of gold in this tenure. Now, I don't have the money to go and extract this 1 ton of gold. So what do they go and do? They go and borrow 1 ton of gold from the central bank. They go and sell that gold into the market. Now they've got the 1 ton of gold in dollars up front to be able to fund operations. They can now go and extract that gold out of the ground, go and give that gold back to the central bank, and everything's hunky-dory. The balance sheet has been squared. However, what that doesn't highlight is that for that period that that gold loan or that gold lease was taking place, you've effectively doubled the amount of gold in circulation, because there's gold sitting on the central bank's balance sheet. So it says there's 1 ton of gold here. And at the same time, the gold miner has sold 1 ton of gold into the market, suppressing the price of gold. So you've doubled the amount of gold. And so this is the challenge that we face in society, is there's a whole lot of gold paper claims. And those gold paper claims, the trading of these gold paper claims suppresses the physical price of gold. And so I do believe that gold should be a hell of a lot higher than what it is today. And I know that people like Luke Groman and a lot of the big gold bugs also agree with that, that there should be a repricing of gold. Gold should be a hell of a lot higher than what it is today. So ultimately, that kind of leads us to kind of Bitcoin again. And it's like the challenge is that we don't know how much gold is in supply. Because of its physical nature, we're constantly abstracting it and using these receipts, which brings in trust. And so Bitcoin came about around 2008 and the financial crisis. And the founder, Satoshi Nakamoto, who's anonymous, we don't know if it's a group, if it's an individual, if they still exist. What's really interesting is he etched in the first Bitcoin block, he etched a newspaper headline, and it said, The Times on the 3rd of January 2009, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. Now, if you go to Google, you can actually go and find that headline. You can go and find the paper. And if you go and read the paper, what it's talking about is the Chancellor, the British Chancellor, is on the brink of the second bailout for banks. And I think what Satoshi is really trying to hint at is that our monetary system is broken. You can simply print money, bail out these various entities, and we do not have a free market where capital flows to where value is being created, where if you are fiscally irresponsible, you're going to wither away. You're not going to be able to support yourself. And so he's trying to highlight that how do we have a monetary system? How can we create a monetary system that has scarcity, that allows or forces more of a free market where capital flows to where value is being created? And so ultimately, if I was to describe Bitcoin at a very, very like high level framing, Bitcoin solves the tangible nature of gold by creating a digital scarce asset that is trustless. There's no issuer. There's no central authority governing its trajectory. So you don't have to trust any singular entity, and it's permissionless. There's no need for middlemen. There's no need for someone telling you what you can and can't do. You can spend this money. You can't spend this money. You can do this. You can't do that. You have full control over your Bitcoin. And so when you've got a trustless, permissionless system, it's similar to the tangible nature of gold if you're using gold as a bearer instrument. No one can tell me what I can and can't do with my gold when I hold physical gold. Well, now we've created a digital version of this. Not only that, but it's transparent. Anyone can interrogate the transaction history. Anyone can see every transaction that's taken place. Anyone is able to see how much Bitcoin there is and the issuance schedule. And so to me, it's solving a lot of the problems that we've seen throughout kind of this evolution of gold and this movement into the digital age.
The transparency of it all. What I find interesting about like the pattern here is just the evolution of scarcity and humans being drawn towards scarcity, but also being drawn to the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
Right. And like this is like with these part of these conversations, what I'm seeing is like Bitcoin is truly becoming a path of least resistance for currency and for exchange. And it's just so accepted now by the world that it's created what it is because of the acceptance, right? Like, yeah, it is just a bunch of numbers and zeros, but the scarcity and the human nature of wanting to own something that's scarce has created this global currency that we can trade around the world with
Totally.
and not having to trust anybody. And it's like when you talk about a trustless system, my first thought goes, oh, well, I don't trust anybody in this system. So talk about what a trustless system means in Bitcoin.
Totally. So ultimately, I think a trustless system, like to your point, I think sometimes we can get confused and we can think trustless, like, can I trust anyone? But that's ultimately the whole point. How do you have a system which you don't need to trust anyone? You don't need to put your faith or believe that someone has your best interest at heart. And so there's a famous saying in Bitcoin, which is Bitcoin is a system built upon rules instead of rulers. When we're dealing with a lot of these gold-backed currencies, these fiat currencies, these paper receipts, ultimately it's a system built on rulers instead of rules. It's the famous saying like rules for thee and not for me. Like ultimately we're able to govern the system in any way that supports, well, the system governs itself in a way that supports itself and not necessarily the individuals. And that's why we have things, well, sorry, you go.
Well, when we put all the power into the hands of the rulers, they just change the rules anyways.
Totally.
Like that's the issue with trusting a small amount of people to be rulers of your country. Like they just change the rules however they want to be in their favor,
100%.
without a
And
question. So
without a
how does
question.
Bitcoin get around that?